You're now watching Around the Horn, the weekly Internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Is May 21st, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horn, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne's latest book, which was just released and is now available for pre-order on the International Publisher's website, and is entitled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., from 1800 to 1865. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back Around the Horn.
Thank you for inviting me.
As we go around the horn, first want to ask you about the meeting between the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa and U.S. President Donald Trump that took place today, May 21st at the White House. The stated purpose of President Ramaphosa's visit to Washington is apparently to reset and revitalize bilateral relations between South Africa and the United States. But Dr. Horne, what is your analysis of today's meeting in the White House between Presidents Ramaphosa and Trump?
Well, first of all, let me apologize on behalf of the anti-Trump movement in the United States for a number of reasons. First of all, it was outrageous and disgraceful, that ambush in the Oval Office where Mr. Trump dragged out newspaper clippings and television monitors in order to make his fallacious and spurious claims about so-called white genocide against the Afrikaner farmers in South Africa. And then, of course, it does a grave disservice to the overwhelming victims of crime in South Africa, which happen to be people of African descent. And in any case, it would be easy to characterize whatever crime is visited upon the Afrikaners. You could characterize that easily as an example of poverty on wealth crimes, as opposed to a so-called anti-white genocide. And of course, the overriding issue is that at our expense, at taxpayers' expense, you've had dozens of these alleged refugees flown to the United States, put up in houses and abodes at our expense. And of course, at the same time, Mr. Trump's regime is removing temporary protective status from 350,000 Venezuelans and countless numbers of Haitians, and sending them back to South America, sending them back to the Caribbean. I can think of no more horrendous example of white supremacy than that particular episode. And I must also apologize on behalf of the anti-Trump movement, insofar as many in our movement do not understand why Mr. Trump did what he did today. They do not understand that that outrageous episode resonates with a goodly number of those in his base, because they expect settler solidarity, which Mr. Trump exemplified, and they expect expressions of white supremacy, which Mr. Trump exemplified. And sadly enough, there are those in our movement who do not even accept the concept of settler colonialism, which was visited ignominiously upon the southern tip of Africa and North America. And because of that lack of acceptance, it makes them makes it difficult for them to understand why Mr. Trump did what he did. Now, I think that the underlying issue, as many South African commentators have pointed out, is that First Buddy, Elon Musk, has a vendetta against his homeland, South Africa, ever since apartheid was overthrown in 1994. And more to the point, he wants the regime in Pretoria to undermine diversity, equity, and inclusion and affirmative action, and allow his Starlink satellite enterprise to enter into the country without those particular regulations being applicable. Now, I think as well that we need a better historical understanding of how we got to this point, because I think many of our friends also underestimate what happened in the run-up to elections in South Africa in 1994. That is to say, the African National Congress and their comrades in the South African Communist Party were unbanned in February 1990. This comes a few months after the collapse of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. And that is important because the regime that was on the way out the door, speaking of East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, Socialist East Germany, was one of the closest comrades of the ANC and their Communist Party allies. And when that regime was headed for the dustbin of history, that was a sign that the apartheid regime could negotiate with their anti-apartheid opponents because they recognized that they were weakened. And these anti-apartheid opponents were weakened further in December 1991 when the Soviet Union itself collapsed. And so therefore, going into negotiations, the anti-apartheid forces were wounded severely and were not necessarily able to negotiate an optimal deal. I should also say that with regard to this country, there was admittedly, avowedly, a strong anti-apartheid movement in the United States of America. But we need to realize as well that there were many liberal forces, particularly the NAACP, who were quite uncomfortable with Nelson Mandela's relationship with the South African Communist Party, because of course the NAACP went all in with regard to anti-communism. And it's not just the NAACP. As we speak today, a leading commentator on Southern Africa, and indeed a leading commentator, believe it or not, on African American matters, is the San Francisco Bay Area writer Adam Hochschild, who happens to be the heir to a fortune, that is to say, a fortune based upon investment in the company once known as Amax, which exploited shamelessly the labor of Africans, particularly in the Congo, and the minerals of Africa. And during the apartheid era, he too was a signal liberal anti-communist opponent of Nelson Mandela, although I doubt if he would admit it today, because of course that's not fashionable. And then I'm afraid to say as well that there are certain forces who are no longer in the land of the living, who happen to be Black Power icons, who sympathized with the anti-Sovietism that bedeviled the African National Congress of South Africa. And they, in turn, were influenced by a man who happened to be a CIA, FBI informant, codenamed Sugar, who came into their purview, speaking of these intelligence agencies, when he worked with Fair Play for Cuba, which was supposedly a pro-Castro group in the United States. But when the files on the JFK assassination were released, and it turned out that the accused assassin of Mr. Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald, also worked with Fair Play for Cuba, codenamed Sugar, was unmasked. And he, as noted, was an influence on these Black Power icons. And of course, I talk about this in part in my book, White Supremacy Confronted. I'll expand upon it further in my forthcoming book on U.S.-China relations, because many of our Black Power friends were deeply influenced by Maoism and deeply influenced by the anti-Sovietism of the the Chinese Communist Party at that particular moment. But in any case, after all is said and done, I'd be remiss if I did not make a critique of some of the individuals and policies within the African National Congress of South Africa. That is to say, that when historians turn to the post-1994 era, I'm sure they'll have a sour analysis of the predecessor of the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, speaking of Jacob Zuma, president roughly from 2009 to 2018, a man engaged in shameless corruption. But this was foreseeable, given the fact that he has countless numbers of children, countless wives, believe it or not. In fact, he reminds me of King Charles II in London in the 17th century. He almost bankrupted England because of all of the corruption that went to his various mistresses and in-laws and children, etc. And in fact, even worse perhaps is the fact that in 2021, after Mr. Zuma was pushed out of office in his home province of KwaZulu-Natal, there was an insurrection, not unlike January 6, 2021 in Washington, D.C., that led to scores being killed. And then he had the audacity and temerity to organize another political party to run against the ANC in the recent elections, which dropped them below the 50% majority that they had theretofore enjoyed. And so if one wants to do a scorecard with regard to post-1994 South Africa, one would have to analyze quite critically the leadership, particularly the leadership of Mr. Zuma. But at the end of the day, I should also mention that South Africa has been in the crosshairs because it had the audacity to drag U.S. ally Israel into the International Court of Justice, where it made out a plausible case for genocide against Palestinians. It had the temerity to join the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is challenging a U.S. and North Atlantic hegemony. And so, once again, let me repeat, we have some apologizing to do on this side of the Atlantic because of our inability to analyze this disgraceful episode in the Oval Office just today. And once we begin to make that sort of analysis, I dare say it would also help us to uplift our movement as well.
Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about Israel's genocide against Palestinians in Palestine. Dr. Horne, as the occupation and genocide not only continues, but seems to be growing more and more intense, brutal, and horrific every day. What is your ongoing analysis of this live-stream genocide, and what also appears to be an Israeli and Zionist crisis?
Crisis indeed, and I think it was exemplified when the Spanish Prime Minister turned up in Iraq for a meeting of the Arab League. Those with some historical understanding might recall that for 700 or 800 years, up until the pivotal year of 1492, the Iberian Peninsula indeed was dominated by Arab and Islamic forces. And so in some ways, history has come full circle. I should also mention this remarkable joint statement issued by France, the United Kingdom, and Canada, pledging and promising sanctions against Israel unless and until they clean up their act. Now, of course, I would be the last person to put credence, particularly into the words of Paris, President Macron in particular. But what I'm pointing out is the fact that Canada, once again, because it is under the gun, under the US imperialist gun, is moving ever closer to France. And that has been exemplified, as I pointed out more than once, by the fact that French nuclear submarines have been spotted off the coast of Nova Scotia within spitting distance of Boston. I should also mention that according to the Washington Post, and it's not a direct quote, it's a paraphrase, but apparently Mr. Trump himself is not necessarily enthused about this ongoing famine, and you can take that for what it's worth. But also in terms of straws in the wind, I paid careful and close attention to the fact that the Black conservative intellectual Glenn Loury of Brown University has left the neoconservative Manhattan Institute. And apparently the trigger was his reading the book by the Black intellectual from Howard University, Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Message, which among other things has a moving chapter about his visit to the occupied territories. And his erstwhile comrades, speaking of Glenn Loury's erstwhile comrades, were not happy by his expressing sympathy for the Palestinians. And interestingly enough, Glenn Loury did something that even some of our friends on the left do not do, which is he in some ways depicted Zionism as a form of identity politics, which of course it is. And sadly, that descriptor by our friends on the left is oftentimes not applied to Zionism nor white supremacy. And so I should also mention another article in the Washington Post that did not receive national attention, which is that when National Security Advisor Mike Waltz was forced out of that plum post and kicked upstairs to be U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, part of the reason was that the Trump team was unhappy with him because he was having discussions with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel in a hawkish mode. And of course, the press reports today that Israel is bent upon launching an attack on Iran, perhaps even this week. And so the fact that Mr. Waltz lost his job because of presumed hawkishness with regard to Iran and sympathy with regard to Israel, it underscores what might be larger issues, which is that we might be in the final chapter of settler colonialism with the unwinding of the excesses of the Zionist enterprise in historic Palestine. I think that if that is the case, Zionists in the United States may suffer as a result because they, like Israel itself, made a huge wager that U.S. imperialism would be preeminent forevermore. And with U.S. imperialism losing altitude and with U.S. imperialism alienating Canada, it may be unraveling the North Atlantic base for Israel. I should also say that with regard to news reports, the maniacal, fanatical anti-China writer Gordon Chang has suggested that Israel might be hedging its bets by welcoming more investment from the People's Republic of China, including building up the Haifa port, which, as you know, has been under siege by the Yemeni forces who are engaging in the responsibility to protect in terms of coming to the defense of the Palestinians. If that is the case, if that story proves to be accurate, I can't see it helping Israeli-U.S. relations, the fact that Israel is investing or moving closer to China. And of course, I've mentioned more than once this Business Week story about Israel leaking sophisticated U.S. military technology precisely to the People's Republic of China. I think, once again, with regard to some of our friends on the left, that they may have overestimated the fact or the alleged fact that the Jewish refugees who streamed to the United States post-1776 received a better shake in North America than they did in Europe. I say that based in part upon some of the research in my forthcoming book, The Capital of Slavery, which, among other things, talks about the anti-Jewish fervor exemplified by a number of the founding fathers. But in any case, I think that as the United States goes deeper into this crisis, as it continues to expel scientists or make scientists feel uncomfortable to the point where a welcome mat has been rolled out in France and other European countries for them. In some ways, the United States might be emulating Germany in the 1930s, which went through a similar episode with regard to expelling scientists, which of course led to Albert Einstein, among others, migrating to the United States, Princeton, New Jersey, in his case. So the bottom line is that this bet that the Zionists made on the United States is unraveling. And I should also mention the fact that the liberals, led by the NAACP, in the 1950s made a similar bet, although their bet was even narrower because they assumed that the liberals, who were at least presumably anti-Jim Crow, would retain influence indefinitely. But now we see the liberals are fleeing hither and yon with these Ivy League universities and law firms bending the knee to Mr. Trump. And so, sadly enough, and I say this without any glee, many in the pro-Zionist community made a bad bet with regard to wagering that U.S. imperialism would remain preeminent. And many in the liberal wing of the Black liberation movement led by the NAACP made a similar bad bet.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to talk to you about the book published on May 13th entitled Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company by Patrick McGee. McGee's book is described by the publisher as explaining, quote, how Apple helped build China's dominance in electronics assembly and manufacturing only to find itself trapped in a relationship with an authoritarian state, making ever-increasing demands. Dr. Horne, it seems that the blame game for the rise of China is in full swing. But what is your analysis of this new book?
Well, Apple in China, which I happen to have read recently, and of course the subtitle is The Capture of the World's Greatest Economy, it makes some rather explosive claims. It says, and I quote, Beijing has allowed Apple to exploit its workers so that China can in turn exploit Apple. China wouldn't be China today without Apple. Its investments in the country have been spectacular. Since 2008, Apple has trained at least 28 million workers in China, more people than the entire labor force of California. And it goes on in this vein with regard to how this multi-trillion-dollar company basically has been essential, according to this book, in the rise of China. And as we've said before, I don't think you can understand the rise of China without understanding not only the labor of the Chinese working class, but I don't think the book really explores the fact that Apple in Cupertino, California, was responding to political signals. That is to say, the Nixon-Kissinger overture to China on an anti-Soviet basis more than a half century ago, the fact that the door was opened for the U.S. industrial plant to migrate across the Pacific under Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s. But having said that, there are some other points, too, that are worthy of exploration that the book does not go into. That is to say, it makes the point that you cannot understand the rise of China without understanding investment from Taiwan, which is, of course, supposedly at odds with China. And with regard to Taiwan, the book only mentions in passing the role of organized crime in terms of the rise of many of these major Taiwanese firms, such as Foxconn, which was a major contract builder for Apple, building many of these iPhones and iPods and iPads that so many enjoy in this country. And it also reminds me as well that the ruling class of this country is becoming ever more concerned about the rise of China. Now, on your screen, you see this op-ed that appeared in the New York Times just a day or two ago. In the future, China will be dominant. The U.S. will be irrelevant. This article and these words seems like they could have come from this particular program. And that raises another point, which is that I understand why many of our friends on the left do not necessarily make these kinds of arguments that you see made in the New York Times just the other day, because many of our friends on the left instinctively have not forgotten the era now that has passed by when if you made comments that were positive about socialism or countries ruled by communists, you could lose your job, perhaps there would be a worse fate in store. But still, I think that the fact that a major publisher could put out this book on Apple and China, making these explosive charges, and that the New York Times can suggest that in the future China will be dominant and the United States will be irrelevant, I think that perhaps that provides cover for our friends on the left to inject their particular spin, their particular argument with regard to what might be the most important story of this millennium, which is the restoration of Chinese hegemony on planet Earth. Because after all, before the advent of the African slave trade and the plundering and despoliation of the Americas, China was probably the leading economic power. And the fact that it's now returning to that pole position should surprise only the naive.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about Japan. On May 12th, there was an article in Foreign Policy entitled "Trump Mistakenly Thinks Japan is a Soft Target. Tokyo is Ready to Play Hardball in Trade Negotiations." Dr. Horne, what is your assessment of how and why Japan is approaching relations with the U.S. in 2025?
Well, understandably, Japan is very apprehensive about crossing U.S. imperialism. We all recall what happened in August 1945 with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one of the most egregious examples of mass murder in the history of humankind. Tens of thousands wiped out within seconds and minutes, with the archipelago of Japan still not able to recover sufficiently. And then, if you fast forward to the mid-1980s, you'll recall the Plaza Accord, whereby the United States and its North Atlantic allies ganged up on Japan, forced a revaluation of its currency, which sent Japan into lost decades. And interestingly enough, the United States would like to do the same thing to China today in 2025. And I say good luck with that, because I don't think China will yield, because China is not in the position that Japan was in the mid-1980s. And perhaps looming above all is the fact that the U.S. ability to borrow, that is to say, the United States government's ability to sell treasury bills, has been handicapped recently. That is to say, the United States has to borrow from China, Japan, Britain, in order to keep the government running. The credit score, the credit rating of the United States has just been downgraded, which not only will mean that the United States will have to pay higher interest rates in order to attract these dollars into the U.S. Treasury, but it also will ricochet throughout the economy, making it more difficult for those looking to buy residences and those looking to buy cars to get a reasonable interest rate, because to a certain extent, the interest rate on treasury bills is a benchmark for interest rates generally. Now on the screen, you also see the book I wrote some years ago, Race War, which talks about how the United States and Britain reacted very badly, to put it mildly, to the rise of Japan, leading to what I've just described. That is to say, this atomic bombing in 1945. And so I think that Japan, which also is undergoing economic difficulty as well, look at what's happening to Nissan, the major Japanese car manufacturer. It's been forced into layoffs because of this ill-considered tariff war that Mr. Trump has launched. So Japan has every reason in the world to play hardball with Washington. The issue that you should be watching out for is whether or not this may lead to some sort of entente between Tokyo and Beijing, which could be a game changer globally, having catalytic impact on the trajectory of U.S. imperialism, that is to say, its downward trajectory. And the fact that we cannot rule out that sort of entente as of May 2025, I think says it all.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask what your thoughts are on the Schomburg Center turning 100 in Malcolm X's 100th birthday that just passed on Monday, May 19th. And to connect and expand on these historic centennials, can you also tell us about your unpublished book title?
Well, yes, sooner rather than later, a manuscript that I wrote some years ago, a young adult book on Malcolm X, will be published. And I look forward to the publication of this work. I trust and I hope that it will be examined carefully, not only by young adult readers, but hopefully by middle-aged readers and senior citizens alike, because there is much to learn from in terms of the example of Malcolm X, whose centenary we're marking in 2025. Likewise, there's much to learn from the Schomburg where I've done quite a bit of research over the years, and I'm happy to say that my own personal papers, my own personal archive, is cited at the Schomburg and 135th and, yes, Malcolm X Boulevard. And I would recommend to those who are within hailing distance of that Harlem neighborhood to drop into the Schomburg and perhaps peruse my papers. But in any case, I think we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.